Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 perverts who changed the world for the better. The history of our world is full of men who are larger-than-life heroes who have become legends over time and now hold a place as something more than just people. They have become symbols of great aspiration or traits that we all wish we could embody. However, sometimes it is also important to remember that these men were also just men, and that men are not perfect and all have their own flaws and quirks. In the video today, we've got the strange perverted oddities of 10 of the most influential men in history. Number 10. Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is literally the most common name when it comes to modern scientific genius. If you want to insult someone, you call them Hitler, and if you want to suggest someone is a genius, even if sarcastically, you invoke the name of Einstein. His theory of relativity and his infinite quotability, although many popular quotes are actually apocryphal or out of context, has made him a symbol of intelligence worldwide. However, while many may respect him for his smarts, he was still a man, and no men are perfect. For Einstein, his weakness was his sexual proclivities and his inability to be faithful or enjoy a normal relationship with another human being. In 1903, Einstein married a woman named Mileva, and he had children with her. But after several years of marriage, he decided he was truly tired of being faithful and went to find a woman to have an affair with. What was particularly strange was his choice, because this was his cousin Elsa Einstein, who was divorced and already had 2 children from a previous marriage. As if this was not odd enough, even once his wife found out, he continued his affair and even wrote about how much his wife bothered him, referring to her as an employee he cannot fire. While most people think of him as having a fairly clean persona, he was not a very nice man or a faithful lover, and his obsession with his cousin, well, that was just a little bit weird. Number 9. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, the former president of the United States, not to be confused with his son and former president George W. Bush, or his other son, failed presidential candidate and former governor Jeb Bush, is really starting to show his advanced years. It seemed not long ago that his speaking career still had legs, but over time he atrophied, and now he is confined to a wheelchair. His public appearances have dropped off greatly as his health has declined, but he still shows up for various events at times and tries to make light of the situation in his own unique way. Unfortunately for both HW and the women who meet up with him, his way of making light of situations apparently involves grabbing women's butts while taking pictures with them, even going so far as to joke that his name is David Copperfield. During the Me Too movement, many women have now come forward complaining about the former president's behavior, one of them even as young as 16. The former president's response was basically to apologize through his spokesman and say that he had meant it all as an innocent joke. Number 8. James Joyce. James Joyce is a literary giant who is mostly known for Ulysses, but also he's one of those authors who is so famous that while you may have only read 1 or 2 things by him because you had to in school, you still know full well that he wrote a whole lot more. As a classic author from a time period most people today consider rather prudish, many might be surprised to know just how dirty of a mind James Joyce actually had. A series of romantic letters between himself and his soon-to-be wife have ended up preserved for posterity. Her part was long since lost, perhaps out of a respect for the fact that she herself was not the celebrity. Regardless, just his side of the letters alone is quite suggestive of how they had fun. It turns out that James Joyce had quite an obsession with farts. In many of the exchanges, he comments on how much he loves it when she farts and how he wishes that she would fart in his face so that he could fully appreciate the smell. In more than one letter, he talks about how he manages to make her fart while having sex and how much he finds this attractive. While it is a harmless fetish and not nearly as bizarre as some, it is still not what someone would expect from a dignified-looking man who wrote classic literature. Number 7. Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey's research on sexual behavior among males and females conducted back in the mid-1900s was groundbreaking and gave us a backbone of knowledge on the subject that is still in use to this very day. For that reason, many at the time considered him to be doing things that were entirely immoral because they felt his research normalized certain sexual behaviors that they found abhorrent. Because he spent so much time researching and writing about such a controversial topic, he has been hit with at least partial blame by one group or another for almost everything anything sexual that somebody doesn't like. Among other things, he's been credited with Roe and Wade, increased sex education, normalization of homosexuality, more use and acceptance of porn, and looser laws against sex offenders. And of course, depending on who you ask, not all of that is a bad thing. Of course, Kinsey himself was a true pervert, but this doesn't detract from the very real research that he did or invalidate the results that he attained. In fact, it should be no surprise that a man who spent his life researching sex had some interesting proclivities himself. Alfred Kinsey was alleged to have had affairs secretly with men, filmed odd sex scenes in his own home, and was a fan of, among other things, urethral stimulation. There are also claims that he encouraged his staff to talk to their partners about having open marriages, although it was unclear if he expected himself to be included or if he just wanted them to be freer with their sexuality. Number 6. Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is one of those figures who has practically been elevated to sainthood. Unfortunately, he doesn't necessarily deserve all of that praise, though. While his peaceful words are great things to live by, and he did do a lot of good, many of his actions and his personal demons may have made him a pariah if the kind of information sharing we have now existed back when he was acting in order to bring about changes in India. One of the things Gandhi preached, apart from non-violence and poverty, was sexual chastity. He even claimed that holding in your sexual fluids made you stronger and more vital over time. However, he also believed that these claims of chastity should be regularly put to the test, something many scholars believe was simply a veiled way for him to continue to find a way to satisfy himself while still feeling spiritual. See, Gandhi liked to sleep among young, naked women, oftentimes in a state of nakedness or mostly nakedness himself. He did not have sex with them, but in some of his writings there is talk of involuntary discharges, and there is plenty of touching going on as it is described that they are sleeping side by side. This makes it rather hard to believe there was nothing sexual going on and that he was truly trying to remain chaste. Some people feel that he may have been using his religious position of trust in order to satisfy himself while appearing chaste. However, what was going through his head will, of course, always be impossible to truly know. Number 5. Amadeus Mozart. Amadeus Mozart is arguably one of the two most famous composers in European history and has influenced countless musical artists over the centuries. His music has been a regular staple in prim and proper concert halls for generations, and people love to play his music to show how classy they are, or just to feel classy for a time. However, for those of you who have seen the movie Amadeus and have watched the rest of this video, then you might imagine where this is going. In the movie Amadeus, a historical fiction, we see a Mozart that can be kind of bawdy, a little wild, and sometimes rather uncouth. While much of the movie is apocryphal or at least wildly inaccurate, the portrayal of Mozart may be more accurate than you might imagine. You see, Germany has always seemed to have a strange thing about poop compared to other countries, and it goes all the way back to the time of Mozart. There are correspondence saved where he wrote to his mother while growing up, wishing her good night while writing her sweet poems about pooping in the bed. He also wrote naughty letters to his cousin, which also included poop, and even wrote songs about it as well. One of them had lyrics that essentially translated to "lick my ass." It is important to note, though, here that there is little to any indication that there was anything incestuous here. While he may have had some kind of fetish, he also just seemed to find it terribly amusing. If nothing else, he was a very perverted jokester. Number 4. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is famous for inventing so many things that he's even been credited with discovering things that he did not discover. He was a founding father, a possible high-ranking Freemason, an influential diplomat who helped bring the French to the United States' side during the Revolutionary War, an inventor, an accomplished writer, and one of the most devious, cunning, sociopathic men to ever walk the earth. Oh, and also he was a pervert with some rather bizarre beliefs. When he had recently got up in the morning, he'd like to take his clothes off and sit with the window open for a good 30 minutes or so. He believed that doing this was for good health, but some today might just call it exhibitionism, but he referred to it as an air bath. However, even worse was how he felt about dating. He once wrote to a man explaining all the reasons he should look to an older woman as a mistress. He explains, among other things, that they will not produce children, are more grateful, more discreet, and that if you look from the neck down, you wouldn't notice much difference. It's unlikely that anyone today would consider him much of a role model, not anyone who wants anyone to respect them, at any rate. Number 3. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is someone most people would probably expect to be in this video, as he is not only known to many as the father of psychoanalysis, but more recently he's become known as that guy with all the crazy theories about sex. Freud's theorizing has not only caused him to be somewhat of a laughingstock in recent years, but he has never really been respected very much because of his wild views. Even though his work in psychoanalysis was groundbreaking, most of his research is simply not applicable today, and at the time he went through periods where he was even less respected. At one point in his career, he was hanging his hat on something called seduction theory, where he believed that much of his patients' problems had to do with traumatic sexual experiences when they were incredibly tiny children. In later years, he realized that he was likely wrong and that his patients had suggested these memories into being with his help. But we now know that memories from an age that young would simply not form properly in a way that they could be repressed and remembered later. Memory simply doesn't work that way. However, this, along with the many crazy theories that he had about children and sex, were not his only odd obsessions. One of his beliefs was that you needed to understand any sexual passion involved between a psychoanalyst and patient, and he would have them discuss things such as masturbation fantasies or dreams. Most of his patients were young women, and at one point he had a session with his own lesbian daughter who he was trying to cure. Number 2. Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy is most known for writing War and Peace and a bunch of other books that most people have not heard of. Still, his name is synonymous with Russian literature, and most people simply think of him as a dignified classical writer. However, the truth is that while Tolstoy may have been a genius writer with incredible talent, he was also a vain, selfish, and hypocritical man who was absolutely sex-crazed. Indeed, he mentally tortured himself over it his entire life. As a young man, he was with prostitutes a lot, but eventually got over that and got married. Still, even with 13 children, he was not a happy man. He became very religious and ultimately started his own brand of Christianity. He preached abstinence and the giving away of worldly goods, while practicing neither of these things. However, the story that truly showed the world who he was and caused the greatest controversy was a short story called The Kreutzer Sonata. In this short story, a man marries a beautiful young woman, and they have several children together. For all intents and purposes, it is a perfect marriage. Unfortunately, the man starts to become bored with married life and fantasizes that a friend of theirs, who comes over to play the piano, usually playing a piece called the Kreutzer Sonata, is in love with his wife, and she is in love with him. The man goes mad and then murders them both, and then has a long monologue on a train with a stranger about how sex is evil and women cause men's hearts to be filled with lust. This may sound quite familiar to what is heard from some very religious people even today, that women are responsible for men's thoughts, at least in part, and need to cover up their bodies to not cause undue temptation. Of course, many argue that the people preaching this are usually men and have some issues with self-control. Number 1. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson is mostly known for his so-called war on poverty and also for being a popular target for conspiracy theorists who believe that he may have been in on or directly behind the death of JFK. After all, the vice president would have more to gain than anyone else and have more power than anyone to cover up an investigation. However, while most people tend to center on those two topics or perhaps his decisions during Vietnam, very little discussion these days tends to go into just how perverted and abusive President Johnson really was. While President Trump may have made some very bad comments in the Access Hollywood tape, the behavior Johnson got away with involving his Johnson would be a horrific scandal today, especially in light of recent movements to speak out against sexual harassment. This was a man who would openly pee in the parking lot, whip his business around at colleagues in the bathroom and ask them if they'd ever seen anything as big, and make his aides stand at the door of the bathroom and take notes while he was emptying himself, among other things. He also liked to refer to his member as Jumbo, and without any proper decorum, loved to find excuses to bring it up or show it off in order to assert his superiority as an alpha male. He was also incredibly physically aggressive with anyone, to a point that many today might refer to it as assault, and physically reject his advances. While he may be a Democrat hero to some today, they likely never knew or have completely forgotten just what a sexually harassing, inappropriate pervert the man was, or they would not be holding him in such high regard. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also over there on the right, some other videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one. And as always, thank you for watching.